begin by reminding some of us and simply informing others that my own understanding of the immigration reform movement through my participation with the Male Ill International, where I'm an employee and we're part of the immigration movement very systematically and intentionally with a campaign. My understanding is that our traditional perspective as far as the government is an enforcement-only perspective, where enforcement of law and order has been the lens through which we have looked at the whole immigration issue. Enforcement-only measures, whatever those measures are, have not and will not work. Enforcement-only measures have left, as you know, a trail of blood, sweat, tears, revengeful raids, swollen jail cells, and large state and national deficits. Enforcement-only measures have created cases of what the military calls friendly fire by killing potential wage relief through wage increases and a decrease in present wages of native-born workers. Whatever we advocate in immigration reform, part of the bottom line has to include, from my perspective, what I call a comprehensive public option with a triple bottom line. Now, I know that public option is a health care reform term. I also know that these are dirty words and fighting words to special interest groups that profit from existing immigration policies. Nevertheless, a comprehensive public option, when not watered down by special interest or political correctness, would include three very important elements, which I call the economic, which is pretty much understood, the second, the ethical, and the third element, which I call the exceptional. One model experts are using to estimate the economic ramifications of immigration reform uses three different scenarios. And the model I'm referring to is called a computable general equilibrium model. And each of these three scenarios focus on the economic concern. The first scenario involves temporary worker programs. While economically beneficial to the nation as a whole, nearly $800 billion over a 10-year period, one continues to question whether it would be native-born friendly. One can also question whether it would cause a downward pressure on a living and sustainable wage for all Americans. There's also the issue of whether this would be too punitive with respect to native-born workers. It would not serve anyone's interest to have a penny-wise and pound-foolish policy that advances the needs of temporary workers while creating financial hardship for native-born full-time workers. This would be likened to reverse financial discrimination. A second scenario, according to the equilibrium model, calls for deportation, and it is closely tied to an enforcement-only strategy. In addition to the trail of blood and escalation of state and national deficits, deportation would be as, if not more, counterproductive than a temporary worker program. According to some estimates, mass deportation would reduce U.S. GDP by 1.46% annually, or over 10 years, $2.6 trillion in financial loss. And that does not even take into consideration escalating costs of deportation. Also, the downsides of deportation, wages would rise for less skilled native-born workers, but would reduce wages for higher skilled workers and would lead to widespread job loss. Therefore, this policy is also considered punitive. A third scenario calls for a pathway to legal status for unauthorized immigrants, while also establishing flexible limits on the number of permanent and temporary immigrants. And this pathway and flexibility is tied, obviously, to the ever-changing labor demands. This would amount to an estimated $1.5 trillion over 10 years. This would certainly be in our national economic self-interest, especially for all who see through the lens of an economic bottom line. This third scenario comes close to what might be called a comprehensive public option in immigration reform. This scenario is more meaningful and substantial than a temporary worker or deportation strategy because it takes very seriously the military notion of friendly fire. But it is also more comprehensive because it includes a second concern which should be important to us as a people of faith, and that is the element of ethics. One of the big problems with the present status, as you know, the health care reform bill, is a loss of ethics to special interests and political correctness. Ethics has to do, as you know, with what is fair, what is just, what is moral. Economics without ethics is immoral and always leads to fragile victories. We cannot afford to lose the ethical element in the immigration reform debate. To protect the ethical element in any meaningful and substantial immigration reform, members of communities of faith are challenged to public eyes, not just publicize the ethical concern. We publicize something by putting it in our worship bulletins, by signing petitions, or by writing nice-sounding religious resolutions. To public eyes, which is a word that I came up to challenge myself, to public eyes with the IZE calls forth a much deeper level of commitment from the ground of our faith. To public eyes is to saturate the public and private spheres with a comprehensive commitment involving our entire being. It is to organize around that which the values of our faith tell us is important to the God of our understanding when it comes to human rights. In my own faith tradition, for example, Jesus Christ came as a personification of God's own interests in human affairs. In my own Christian faith tradition, God could have continued to send public service announcements through angels or through written words, but God decided to come personally and manifested himself in the humanity of Jesus Christ in order to put his values out in public in a way that was very personal, in the same way that others have done so. Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, and others, St. Francis of Assisi. All of us know of persons who took their values so very seriously that to use their voice to make public announcements was good, but was not good enough. And so I simply share that to say persecution, suffering, and death come at the hands of people who feel their economic interests or political tenure threatened by those committed to the ethical principles of their faith on behalf of the left out and the left behind. The third element and a triple bottom line that comprehensive immigration reform has to take into consideration as a part of this movement is what I call the exceptional element. This is where the reinforcement notion is essential. Reinforcement measures focus on those things great and gracious. By great, I mean great for the American economy, great for workers because of minimal friendly fire that neither kills nor punishes native-born workers. By gracious, I mean hospitable to those seeking legal status for any number of reasons. As communities of faith, we are challenged to advocacy and action in